Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering stories that the mainstream press either buries on page 12 or sanitizes beyond recognition. We're talking about a child killed in her classroom by Israeli forces, Hezbollah drawing lines in the sand against Lebanese capitulation, Pakistan's defense minister calling Israel a curse on humanity before deleting the post under pressure, the political forces inside Israel that could finally end Netanyahu's grip on power, and how the war in Iran is quietly driving up the cost of everything from airline tickets to ground logistics. These stories are connected. Let's get into it.
We start tonight with a story that should be leading every broadcast in the Western world but isn't. A Palestinian girl was killed by Israeli forces while sitting in her classroom. She left home that morning dressed for school. She came back wrapped in a burial shroud. Middle East. I reported this, and I want you to sit with that image for a moment. This is not a military target. This is not a Hamas operative. This is a child, in a school, doing what children do. And she was killed during what Israel continues to call a precision military operation.
Let's be absolutely clear about what precision means in this context. The Israeli military has one of the most advanced targeting systems on the planet, supplied and funded largely by the United States. Billions of dollars in weapons technology, satellite guidance, real-time intelligence. And yet a girl dies in a classroom. Either the targeting is not as precise as they claim, which means they're lying to the American taxpayer funding these weapons, or the targeting is precise and a school was deemed an acceptable strike zone. Neither explanation is defensible. Both should be criminal.
And this is not an isolated incident, Alex. Since October 2023, the pattern has been unmistakable. Schools, hospitals, refugee camps, clearly marked UN facilities, all struck. The Israeli government's standard response is that Hamas embeds among civilians, therefore civilian infrastructure becomes legitimate targets. But international humanitarian law does not work that way. Even if combatants are present near a school, the principle of proportionality demands that you do not kill children to reach them. That principle is being shredded in real time, and the world's most powerful governments are watching it happen.
What the mainstream media will not tell you is who benefits from the normalization of these killings. Every time a story like this gets a 48-hour news cycle and then vanishes, it sets a precedent. It tells the Israeli military and its political leadership that the cost of killing a child in a classroom is temporary outrage and zero accountability. No sanctions. No arms embargo. No war crimes tribunal with teeth. The benefit flows upward to a political class in Israel that needs perpetual conflict to stay in power, and we're going to get to Netanyahu specifically in a moment.
The family of this girl will receive no justice through any existing international mechanism, and that's by design. The International Criminal Court has moved at a glacial pace on Palestine. The United States has historically vetoed every meaningful UN Security Council resolution that would impose consequences on Israel. So the architecture of international law, which was supposedly built after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of atrocity, is functionally disabled when it comes to Palestinian children. That's not a bug in the system. That is the system working as the powerful intend it to work.
Now let's connect this to our second story, because it flows directly. Hezbollah's Secretary General Naim Qassem has called on the Lebanese government to stop offering what he called free concessions to Israel. This is a significant statement, and the Western press is framing it as Hezbollah being obstructionist or threatening. But let's look at what's actually happening on the ground. Lebanon has been under enormous pressure, particularly from the United States and France, to make diplomatic accommodations to Israel along the southern border, concessions that would effectively neutralize Hezbollah's defensive posture without Israel giving anything in return.
The term free concessions is doing a lot of work in that statement, and it's worth unpacking. What Qassem is saying is that the Lebanese government is negotiating against itself. Israel has not withdrawn from disputed territories. Israel has not stopped its overflights of Lebanese airspace, which are a direct violation of sovereignty. Israel has not addressed the detention of Lebanese citizens. And yet Lebanon is being asked to disarm its most capable military force south of the Litani River and offer security guarantees to a nation that invaded it in 1982, again in 2006, and continues to violate its borders regularly.
Here's what the mainstream framing misses entirely. Hezbollah is not simply a militant group. In southern Lebanon, it functions as a state within a state because the actual Lebanese state has been hollowed out by decades of corruption, civil war, and economic collapse, much of it facilitated by the same Western powers now demanding concessions. When you destroy a country's institutions and then demand that the one organization providing security, hospitals, and schools in the south simply lay down its arms, you're not asking for peace. You're asking for surrender dressed up in diplomatic language.
And who benefits from that surrender? Israel gets a neutralized northern border without having to negotiate anything of substance. The United States gets to claim a diplomatic victory in an election cycle. France gets to reassert its colonial-era influence in Lebanon. And the Lebanese people, particularly in the south, lose the only deterrent that has prevented another full-scale Israeli invasion. Qassem understands this calculus perfectly. His statement is not warmongering. It's a rational actor saying, "You're giving away our leverage for nothing," and calling it statesmanship.
The broader pattern here is what I call asymmetric diplomacy, and it's been the playbook in the Middle East for decades. One side is asked to make concrete, verifiable concessions, disarm, withdraw, recognize, normalize, while the other side offers vague promises of future negotiations. We saw it with Oslo. We saw it with the Abraham Accords. The Palestinians gave recognition, made security commitments, and got expanding settlements in return. Now Lebanon is being pushed down the same path, and Hezbollah is the only actor in the room saying out loud what everyone else knows: this deal is structured to benefit Israel at Lebanon's expense.
Let's move to our third story now, because it illuminates the diplomatic pressure cooker surrounding all of this. Pakistan's defense minister publicly called Israel a curse for humanity. That is extraordinary language from a cabinet-level official of a nuclear-armed nation. And then the post was deleted. Think about what that sequence tells you. A senior government official in a country of 240 million people felt strongly enough to put those words on the record, and then the machinery of diplomatic pressure forced a retraction, reportedly ahead of sensitive US-Iran negotiations.
The deletion is more revealing than the statement itself. Pakistan has a complicated relationship with the United States: military aid, counterterrorism cooperation, nuclear tensions, the whole geopolitical tangle. For a defense minister to call Israel a curse on humanity and then delete it suggests that a phone call was made. Pressure was applied. The message was clear: do not complicate the Iran negotiations by publicly siding with the anti-Israel narrative. This is how the diplomatic system enforces silence. Not through censorship laws, but through economic and military leverage applied behind closed doors.
And let's talk about what he actually said, because curse for humanity is not diplomatic hedging. That is a moral judgment, and it reflects genuine sentiment across much of the global south. In Pakistan, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in South Africa, in most of Latin America, what Israel is doing in Gaza is viewed as a genocide. That is not a fringe position internationally. It is the mainstream position of the global majority. What's fringe is the Western position that this is a legitimate self-defense operation. The defense minister was speaking for billions of people, and he was silenced because that truth is inconvenient for American diplomatic objectives.
This connects to a fundamental dishonesty in how the West talks about international opinion. When the United Nations General Assembly votes overwhelmingly to condemn Israeli actions, it's dismissed as theater. When the International Court of Justice rules that Israel's occupation is illegal, it's called non-binding and ignored. When South Africa brings a genocide case to the ICJ, it's framed as politically motivated. But when a handful of Western nations support Israel, that's called the international community. The math doesn't work. The so-called international community is about 15% of the world's population overruling the other 85%.
The timing of that deleted post matters enormously, Alex. It came ahead of US-Iran talks, which tells us that the diplomatic ecosystem is being carefully managed to create conditions favorable to Washington's agenda. Any public statement that frames Israel as a moral liability rather than a strategic asset threatens to shift the negotiating dynamics. Pakistan was told, implicitly or explicitly, that its relationship with the United States depends on maintaining a very specific public posture on Israel, regardless of what its leadership or its population actually believes.
And that brings us to our fourth story, the one about Iran and Netanyahu. Middle East Eye's analysis raises a fascinating question: could Iran be the issue that finally kills Netanyahu's political career? Because here is what's happening inside Israeli politics that almost no American outlet is covering with any depth. Netanyahu's coalition depends on far-right parties who want permanent annexation of the West Bank and a maximalist military posture. But the Iran situation is exposing a rift. The war is expensive. The reservists are exhausted. The economy is under strain. And the public is starting to ask whether Netanyahu's Iran hawkishness is strategic or just personal survival.
Netanyahu has been warning about Iran as an existential threat for over 20 years. He literally stood at the United Nations with a cartoon bomb diagram. But the threat has always served his domestic political purposes more than it has reflected actual Israeli security doctrine. Military and intelligence leaders inside Israel have repeatedly said, on the record, that Iran is a manageable challenge, not an existential one, and that diplomatic containment was working before Netanyahu helped torpedo the JCPOA nuclear deal. He killed diplomacy because diplomacy doesn't keep him in power. Fear does.
Here's the calculus that nobody in Washington wants to discuss openly. Netanyahu needs conflict with Iran to maintain his coalition. His coalition partners, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, are messianic nationalists who view permanent war as divinely ordained. If Netanyahu pivots toward any kind of diplomatic resolution with Iran, they walk and his government collapses. But if he continues escalation, the economic and military costs mount, centrist Israelis peel away, and his government collapses anyway. Iran has put him in a political vice grip, and for the first time, there may not be an escape route.
The implications are profound for the entire region. If Netanyahu's political survival depends on escalation, then every diplomatic off-ramp becomes a threat to him personally. The US-Iran negotiations that Pakistan's defense minister almost complicated? Netanyahu doesn't want those to succeed. A deal with Iran removes his primary justification for emergency governance. Peace is an existential threat to a leader whose power depends on war. And that means the United States is simultaneously trying to negotiate with Iran while funding and arming an Israeli leader who has every incentive to sabotage those same negotiations.
Let me put this in the bluntest terms possible. American taxpayers are funding both sides of a contradiction. Their tax dollars go to Israel, where Netanyahu uses the military and intelligence apparatus to undermine any deal with Iran. And their tax dollars fund the American diplomatic machinery trying to reach a deal with Iran. It's like paying two lawyers to argue against each other in the same courtroom and then wondering why nothing gets resolved. The only people who benefit from this arrangement are defense contractors and politicians who use the perpetual crisis to avoid accountability.
Now let's bring in our fifth story, because it shows how all of this war and instability has very real economic consequences that reach into ordinary people's lives. Electrek reports that Oshkosh is deploying ground support robots at airports to deal with rising fuel costs driven by the war in Iran. This might sound like a feel-good technology story, but read between the lines. The war in Iran is ratcheting up fuel prices globally. Airlines are bleeding money on ground operations. And the response is not to end the war. The response is to automate away human jobs to absorb the costs that war creates.
This is the part of the war economy that never makes the front page. When fuel prices spike because of conflict in the Persian Gulf, it doesn't just affect your gas pump. It cascades through every supply chain on the planet. Airlines, shipping companies, agriculture, manufacturing, all of it runs on fuel. Oshkosh's robot solution is ingenious engineering, but let's be honest about what's driving it. The automation push isn't happening because robots are better. It's happening because war has made human-operated ground support economically unviable. Workers are being replaced not by progress but by the economic fallout of geopolitical violence.
And notice who absorbs the cost at each level. The oil companies post record profits during price spikes. The defense contractors sell more weapons to sustain the conflict causing the spikes. The airlines pass costs to consumers through higher ticket prices. And the ground crew workers, the baggage handlers, the fuel truck operators, the people doing physically demanding work for modest wages, they get replaced by robots. The profits of war flow upward. The costs of war flow downward. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the documented, observable structure of the war economy.
Oshkosh, to be clear, is not the villain in this particular story. They're a company responding rationally to market conditions. But those market conditions were created by political decisions, the decision to escalate with Iran, the decision to maintain military postures that keep the Persian Gulf unstable, the decision to prioritize weapons sales over diplomatic resolution. Every robotic baggage handler at an airport is, in a very real sense, a consequence of someone in Washington choosing war over peace. The technology is neutral. The conditions that make it necessary are entirely political.
And here is where all five of these stories converge into one picture. A child is killed in a classroom in Palestine. Hezbollah warns against giving away Lebanese sovereignty for nothing. Pakistan's defense minister speaks the truth and is forced to retract it. Netanyahu's political survival depends on endless war with Iran. And the economic fallout of that war pushes automation that eliminates working-class jobs at airports. These are not 5 separate stories. They are 5 facets of the same global system, a system where war is not a failure of policy but a feature of it, because war concentrates wealth and power in the hands of those already holding both.
Let's talk about the media's role in all of this, because it is central. When a Palestinian child is killed in school, the headline uses passive voice, "Girl dies in strike," as if the bomb fell from the sky with no human decision behind it. When Hezbollah calls for fair negotiations, the headline reads "Militant group rejects peace efforts." When Pakistan's minister speaks candidly, the story becomes diplomatic gaffe ahead of talks. The language is doing ideological work. It is framing resistance as extremism, accountability as obstruction, and honest speech as diplomatic error. The vocabulary itself is a weapon.
And the stories that get the most oxygen are the ones that serve the preferred narrative. The Oshkosh automation story will get covered as a tech innovation piece. It will be framed around efficiency, sustainability, and the future of airports. What it will not mention is that this automation wave is being driven by a war that the United States chose to support and that fuel prices are a direct, traceable consequence of military escalation in Iran. The connection between war and your job disappearing will not be drawn by mainstream outlets because drawing that connection implicates the advertisers, the defense contractors, and the political class that funds the networks.
So what do we do with all of this? First, we refuse to let these stories be separated. The child in the classroom and the robot at the airport are connected by the same thread of militarized capitalism. Netanyahu's political survival and Pakistan's forced silence are connected by the same American hegemonic pressure. Hezbollah's warning about free concessions and the global South's outrage at Israeli impunity are connected by the same asymmetry of power. When you see these connections, the world stops looking chaotic and starts looking designed. Not by a shadowy cabal, but by a system of incentives that rewards war, punishes dissent, and socializes the costs onto the people least able to bear them.
Second, we follow the money. Every weapons contract, every fuel price spike, every automation deal that replaces human workers, there is a paper trail. The defense stocks that rise when Iran tensions escalate. The lobbying dollars that flow from Lockheed Martin and Raytheon to the congressional committees that authorize arms sales to Israel. The revolving door between the Pentagon and the boardrooms of the companies profiting from perpetual conflict. This information is public. It is available. The mainstream media simply chooses not to connect the dots because connecting the dots would indict the system that sustains them.
Third, we hold our own governments accountable. If you are an American citizen, your government is sending your money to fund the military that killed that girl in her classroom. That is not an opinion. That is a budget line item. $3.8 billion a year in military aid to Israel, and that was before the supplemental packages. You have a right, and I would argue a moral obligation, to demand that your representatives explain how precision weapons funded by your taxes end up killing children in schools. Call your representative. Show up at town halls. Make this issue impossible to ignore.
And for our international audience, your governments are complicit too. The United Kingdom continues to approve arms export licenses to Israel. Germany invokes historical guilt to shield Israel from any criticism, even as it claims to uphold international humanitarian law everywhere else on the planet. Canada talks about human rights while its pension funds invest in companies supplying components for Israeli military equipment. France pressures Lebanon into concessions while selling weapons across the Gulf. Every Western democracy that claims to stand for rules-based order is currently making an exception for the one case where the rules most clearly apply.
Finally, and this is the most important thing I'll say tonight, do not let them make you numb. That is the strategy. Flood the zone with so much horror, so much complexity, so many competing narratives, that you disengage. That you decide it's too complicated, too far away, too entrenched to change. The moment you check out is the moment the system wins. A child went to school today and did not come home. That fact is not complicated. It is not ambiguous. It does not require a degree in international relations to understand. A child was killed, and the people who killed her face no consequences. Your outrage is not naive. Your outrage is the only appropriate response.
This is Truth Report. We are asking you tonight to do one thing. Pick one of these stories and go deeper. Read the Middle East Eye report on that girl. Look up the Hezbollah statement in full context, not the sanitized Western summary. Find out who your elected representatives' top defense industry donors are. Look at the Oshkosh story and trace the fuel price spike back to the policy decisions that caused it. One story. One thread. Pull it, and the whole tapestry starts to unravel. That is how systems of power come undone, not through grand revolution, but through millions of people refusing to look away. I'm Maya Clarity.
And I'm Alex Truth. We don't do surface-level news. We do the work that the corporate press won't, because their paychecks depend on them not doing it. Share this episode. Talk about it with people who disagree with you. The conversation is the weapon. Truth Report, we'll see you next time.